It's funny, in doing this research for this today, I went back to look at some of your older work, and I read your final Fed column, your sign off from that. And I was reading it and I was quite fascinated by all of it. But then you make mention of a particularly drunk and angry clown. And I was worried that that was actually me because I think I fulfilled both of those characteristics on
You
one of
were
my visits to Fed.
you were a guest several times. Many times you were drunken. Occasionally you were clownish. I don't believe you were ever angry, and I can tell you that specifically. I don't remember this last column, but I know what I was referring to was I had an idea at one point about like what if we did a column where I had birthday party clowns over, and somehow
Oh,
someone
sorry.
had suggested some
Okay.
particular clown, and I'd called him to sort of do a greening interview to see like, do I think he would be an interesting guest? And when I called him like in the middle of the afternoon, he was drunk and angry.
Oh
And
God, right.
it was
So
such
it was
an
a literal,
unpleasant
literally a clown. I see.
literally
I
meant
get
to
it.
clown,
Right,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
So from Fed, what did you move on to do? Because you had already published the book How to Host a Dinner Party, right?
Yeah, I mean, over the course of 5 years of that column, I hosted hundreds of dinners and became, not intentionally, but de facto expert in dinner
Yeah,
parties.
yeah.
And I wrote a book about it, which I love doing. I'm very proud of. And then when that ended, I started writing more broadly um, for the Globe and Mail a lot,
Yes.
mostly because I was being um, very much supported by an editor, Denise Balkasoon, who's now, I believe, editor in chief at the Narwhal.
Yes.
And she really had a lot of faith in pushing me beyond the boundaries of what I've been writing about. And it really began with a piece we worked on together about what cooks get paid and how wage theft is sort of standardized within the restaurant industry. And that really sort of changed the course of my writing. I mean, with Denise, I wrote pieces about um, food in prison, food in hospitals, food education in school, access to water, indigenous issues, a lot of really interesting things, but it was the labor aspect of hospitality that really sort of grabbed my attention because it was something that I had always wanted to write about. And it took me a long time, those 5 years really to develop the chops to be able to report and write properly about. And once I did, that really kind of galvanized me and became my focus. A little bit unfortunately, because at the time, no editor wanted to hear about that.
Interesting.
Um,
Yes.
yeah, I mean, editors would sort of be dismissive either of my insight as if you've got a beat reporter, whether they're a court reporter or environment, whatever the issue is, if they're on your staff, you're inclined to say, well, you're our staff expert. But when they're a freelancer, you go, who are you to know what goes on in this
Indeed.
industry, even though this is the industry I've been covering for years. Well, there was occasional disbelief from editors who are like, well, if this is true, how come I'm not reading about it in the New York Times? Combined with the traditional sort of consumer focus rather than business focus, or certainly that's not the right way to phrase it. A focus on consumers as readers
Right.
and a shift away from labor in favor of business in terms of business reporting.
Now, all of this thinking culminated in your book, The Next Supper, which I found a very good read indeed. And I've been reading your work for a long time now, but I felt it was the most evolved and matured writing that I've read from you. Would that be a fair enough observation?
That's a nice compliment. I mean, that was the culmination of that, let's say, because having read all these or written all these disparate pieces over the years, that was sort of the red string on the conspiracy corkboard coming
Yep.
together and saying, I think this is a bigger story, it needs to be a book. And
There,
that's how that book came about.
there was a sense that you were perhaps a bit more self-aware as a writer in that particular book. Would that be a fair enough observation, or is that something that I've just imagineered in my head?
Well, let's credit that to editors. a bit.
Okay,
And
fair
I
enough.
think there's a difference in, the sort of frantic nature of short piece writing that one does for newspapers and magazines and so on, where you're constantly, every piece you write, as passionate as you are, a very large portion of that piece needs to be the previously on portion of the story. You need to catch the readers up to speed, even if you're saying, "Well, look, this is the fifth piece.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
following this story. I've written on this." You need to do that sort of previously on the last six episodes,
Yeah.
and then try, and while at the same time trying to shoehorn in your lead about why this is news. And I remember one of the first edits I got, or notes I got from an editor in terms of a sample chapter, is, "Hey, this isn't newspaper writing. You can take more time.
Yeah.
If they're reading chapter six, it's probably because they like chapters 1 through 5. You don't have to get right to the most, news hook aspect of your story. You can be more patient. Your readers are with you. Take
Um,
them with you into the story." And so there's a lot more sort of measured pace
Yeah, I
in
was
a
going to
book.
say you can take your time to build that momentum, because that's what I found most enjoyable about the book was what you were working towards at the end of the book, going through all of these different chapters. I thought it was a really good read. I really enjoyed it. I should have interviewed you about that when it was first released, but it took me a long time to read that. I had a pile of books on my desk, and it took me a while to get to it. For that, I apologize.
We all have a pile of books on our desk or bedside table, and we don't always get to them. So I'm glad that you did, and that you enjoyed it.
Eventually. Perhaps it would be churlish of me to ask you to compare Winnipeg and Toronto from a culinary point of view, but I shall.
Oh, no contest. It's Winnipeg all the way, right?
Tell me about Winnipeg. I'm not all that familiar with it.
I mean, I'm still getting to know it. It's the whole province is, I think, 1.3 million people. The city is three-quarters of a million people, maybe a little less than that. And it's a very different scene. I mean, there's no media dinners here. It's just
Mhm.
a smaller economy. People don't have that budget for publicity, but there's great food. Strangely, or not strangely, but it took me some time to recognize, even agriculturally, little differences. I kept going. There's a farmer's market in our neighborhood. We started a garden on the front lawn. I love gardening.
Huh.
But we would go to the farmer's market. I remember the beginning of the summer, and there'd be um, lettuce because they were growing it indoors. And then gradually there was, zucchini and things like that. And I remember towards the end of the summer, I kept going, like, I asked someone at one point, said, "When am I going to see peaches or plums?" And they said, "Yeah, we don't grow that here.
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah.
We don't grow any stone fruit." And it was just, something
No, I wouldn't have considered that either. Yeah, of course.
it hadn't occurred to me. Or, the fact that I'll see every variety of apple on supermarket shelves that you would see in Ontario, except for some reason, the russet. Never seen a russet here. Loblaws has the same dominance, but I've never seen a russet. And in restaurant culture, I knew moving here, look, there aren't 6,000 restaurants here,
Mm.
but there also isn't the same population, the same economy, the same blah, 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 10,000 lawyers who are going to support this variety. But I also learned, well before moving here, there was a period when I started writing about labor in restaurants and started caring a lot more about where I ate and how people were treated. And I realized just the whole zeal for going to the new place and having an opinion about the new place, it had worn off and it stopped being important. And what was more important was recognize the restaurants that I loved that continued to provide great, experiences, and wanting to frequent them and support them. And that I didn't need 6,000 restaurants. I needed 6 or 16 maybe. That once I had found my favorite northern Chinese place that did, handmade noodles with a chili oil, that's the place I wanted to go to until someone was murdered in that restaurant and I had to find a new one. But you take my meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
And I eventually, and my northern Chinese noodle place in Winnipeg. Winnipeg doesn't have the Sri Lankan population that Toronto does. I mean, no Canadian city does, but it has a very minuscule Sri Lankan population, and I love Sri Lankan food. But I eventually found someone on, Facebook Marketplace who was cooking out of her home, and started going to her place to pick up kotu roti.
Very cool.
A nice Italian place. So being able to find a bit of this, a bit of that, while ultimately accepting there is not going to be the restaurant culture here that there is there. And then it being more of a special occasion when I go back to visit and I hit, a few spots. And again, it's when I go to Toronto, it's for business or to see people. My restaurant visits are much more about spending time with people than trying something new. And I want to go back to the places I already know are great. I've been passionate about that message for years, of reminding people, do you want to go to the new place, which has about 30% likelihood that it's going to be a good meal and experience? Or do you want to go back to the place that served you a great meal and was gracious? And because you are a regular now, your experiences are only going to get better and better as they are happy to see you.
So in closing, Corey, what are you working on right now? What's a regular day for you? What does that entail?
Right now, it's kind of chaotic because I'm in the midst of, I've been consulting a lot the last couple of years,
Mhm.
working with clients both on sort of staff retention stuff. I worked with a restaurant that wanted to eliminate tipping, and not for everybody,
Mhm.
but if you decide that's for you, like that was a great project, and they've stuck with it and they're doing well. And sort of, I worked for a big food hall here, the Forks, and what I would probably describe as sort of quality assurance, but basically being a restaurant critic but for internally, instead
Yes,
of
yeah.
writing a review for the public, meeting with operators and saying, here's your strengths and weakness and
Very
what to
cool.
improve on. That just wrapped up recently, and I've got like 15 stories right now. I started writing for CNN, and a lot for TVO, the Globe and Mail, and I'm starting to develop a new book. And for that, I'm hopefully going out at the end of January to LA, for a sample chapter, to spend time staging in a really fascinating restaurant that I hope is an example, if not a paragon, of how hospitality can look in the future if
I
people
see.
want to be creating sustainable businesses, not simply sustainable ingredients, but businesses that really have longevity. So that's a
What
little tease.
what is the working title of this upcoming book?
Working title is The Search for the Perfect Meal. I put the question mark on the end there. I don't know. It was a search for the perfect restaurant. It's sort of like
Mhm.
exploring this idea of like, what if I was writing a restaurant list of like, these are the best restaurants, but it wasn't just like, this is the most amazing exotic meal, the most lavish service, so much as like, what if that list included how people are treated
Yeah,
and how a
yeah,
business is integrated with the community
I get it.
and actually creating careers, and not merely transient jobs, but also kick-ass delicious food. So
Right.
a bit of all of that, and hopefully it's me
The full
um,
package. Yeah.
following this formula of like, let me be a fly on the wall, starting with me doing a stage at my age inside a crudo restaurant in Santa Monica.
Sounds great. I'll look forward to that. Corey, thank you for joining us at Good Food Revolution today. Really nice to catch up, and hopefully we'll see you at some point in Toronto.
Yeah, that'd be a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Bye for now.